Good evening and welcome to the new Bugajski Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK. And today I will be discussing important security questions with our special guest on the Bugajski hot seat, Wess Mitchell, until recently the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia. But first, my political commentary on a key international topic is entitled Albania on the Brink. Albania is sliding towards conflict with potentially far-reaching repercussions. Political radicalism and social unrest may block Albania's path towards European Union integration, weaken its relations with the United States, and open a new front for Moscow. Compared to the economic crash in 1997, when tens of thousands of citizens lost their life savings, Albania's current pyramid schemes are both political and economic. Clientelism and corruption have deeply infected both major parties, while there is no viable third alternative. Even more destabilizing than official corruption is the extreme political polarization. The Democratic Party has abandoned its parliamentary seats and called for the Socialist Party government to resign ahead of early elections. However, a national election without some grand bargain between major political players will simply reproduce resentment amongst the next election losers and begin another cycle of protests. The opposition Democrats also boycotted Albania's June 30th local elections and staged mass demonstrations. Some protests have spawned violence, and Democrat leaders warn of further escalation after Election Day. The institutional crisis has also deepened, with Parliament initiating procedures to oust President Ilir Meta for allegedly violating the Constitution by trying to cancel the local elections. The cycles of boycotts and protests have become commonplace in Albania and seriously damaged the country's reputation and further postponed the initiation of EU accession talks. Governments in France and Holland, who oppose further union enlargement, will point at the street violence, political divisions, and institutional weakness as evidence that Albania does not belong in Europe. The potential descent into chaos of a NATO member and a staunch US ally must be prevented through a firmer diplomatic initiative that pushes both sides towards dialogue, reins in militants, and diffuses tensions. Unfortunately, the Donald Trump administration has paid insufficient attention to Albania, having focused primarily on resolving the Macedonia-Greece and Kosovo-Serbia disputes. For almost a year, Albania has had no US ambassador. The absence of a senior envoy sends a signal of indifference and encourages political radicalism. Statements from the State Department that violence must be avoided are insufficient if the roots of the problem are not tackled and the US does not take a more forthright role. Washington must also be aware that political fragmentation, public revolt, and potential regional instability will open another Balkan door to Moscow's subversive interventions. It is time now for the Bugajski hot seat, and our guest today is Wess Mitchell, until recently the US Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia, and he is now back with us at CEPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis, as Vice Chairman of the Board. So welcome, Wess, welcome to the show, welcome back to CEPA.
Thank you for having me, Janusz.
So let's begin. I mean, we have a lot of ground to cover. During your service as Assistant Secretary, and since, of course, what has been happening since. And I think it's fair to say that you served in one of the most demanding positions in the State Department, covering, I believe, 54, 55 countries, in very diverse regions of Europe and Eurasia. Very basic question for our audience that I keep being asked when I'm there. Has US policy actually changed towards Europe, would you say, in general, and policy towards the European Union in particular during the Donald Trump administration?
Well, I think policy on the things that matter most, meaning the U.S. security commitment to Europe, the determination to create a deterrent against Russian pressure on the East, I would argue we see continuity. I think where you see change are in neglected areas of the recent past, where the balance of benefits and burdens in the transatlantic relationship are not equitable. So I think there has been for some time now growing frustration in Washington, for example, about the inequitable burden sharing in NATO. This administration has taken a novel approach, an approach that I would argue has been more successful than the recent past in increasing member state contributions to NATO collective defense. Transatlantic trade, long-standing question of how you get the balance of burdens and opportunities right in transatlantic trade, but the reality remains that there is an uneven playing field for American companies operating in Europe, much more uneven than European companies find when they operate in the United States.
Right.
So I think this is another area where the administration has inherited a similar problem set to its predecessors, but has taken a more creative approach, emphasizing greater pressure, of course, which is not without perils. But in both cases, I think you see the U.S. looking at a 21st century map where we have real challengers. Russia is not down and out for the count. China is emerging as a major player. And in essence, I think the administration's message to Europe has been, we have to take strategic competition seriously. We have to balance the burdens and benefits inside the West in order for us to have a chance of competing successfully with those external non-Western challengers.
Right. Would you say that Brexit and the internal conflicts within the EU, the rise of nationalism, populism, anti-EU skepticism, would you say that has negatively affected relations with Washington?
Well, I think it's a phenomenon that has been unfolding for some time. And one of the drivers is the return of geopolitical and geoeconomic competition. One of the drivers, I think, is a dissatisfaction among Western electorates, including in the United States, with the way that mainstream parties of both left and right have approached the question of globalization and how you ensure that it brings opportunities across the board inside countries. But I think there's something deeper than that. I don't think it's only economic or even primarily economic. I think it's also cultural. It has to do with people's identity. There was a moment after the Cold War where Western leaders and elites, I think, sort of collectively told themselves that history had ended, that geopolitics had ended, and that the things that traditionally have mattered in history, the nation state being chief among them, would no longer matter in the 21st century. And I think what we're seeing is a collective pushback in a number of Western countries to that idea, and an assertion of, or a reassertion of the desire for accountability at the level of the nation state. The key now will be to recognize that that is a legitimate set of concerns. It's being legitimately expressed through democratic process, but to channel those frustrations towards a constructive outlet that leads to a stronger Western order. And I think that's the main challenge that we're navigating now.
Right. And part of it is the fact that there is no, let's say, single European identity. There's a lot of resentment against overrule, if you like, from Brussels, often unelected bureaucrats, diplomats, and so forth. But would you say, in terms of US policy, is the US neutral in the future of the EU? Does it support a strong EU? Does it prefer to deal with individual governments? Or is it sort of a mixture of all the above?
Well, the traditional U.S. approach to the European Union, all the way back to the 1950s, has been to support the goal of a collective European approach to common problems, but to not get deeply enmeshed in the details of intra-European debates. And I think that's been a consistent approach through administrations of both parties, all the way back to the maybe the Truman administration. I think we started to see a deviation from that under the previous administration in Brexit, where the United States became more conspicuously, or let's say it expressed more conspicuously its opinions about desired outcomes in those internal debates than we have in the past. And I think we also became more embroiled in some of the disputes between the European Commission and individual member states. And I think the general U.S. interest should be to want to see a strong and stable Europe, but to leave the details of integration to Europeans. My perception, if you look at the polling data in a lot of European countries, I think Europeans look at the results of a string of recent crises and are increasingly questioning the the core value proposition of the EU since the Cold War, which has essentially been that the EU can provide certain public goods in a globalized world more efficiently than its member states. But I think the 2009 financial crisis raised questions about whether the EU is structured to prevent or manage sustained financial turbulence and therefore guard the financial security of Europeans. I think the migrant crisis, above all, raised questions in the minds of a lot of European voters, particularly in the East and in the South, about whether the European Union has the desire or ability to guard the borders of the EU. So those two things alone, financial security and border security.
And the Greek financial crisis.
And the Greek financial crisis. So I think there is a process, there's a crisis of federalism that is playing out inside Europe, and the American interest is to see a stable Europe that's prosperous, shares close relationship and values with the United States, but only Europeans themselves can work out the question of the future of the European Union, whether it entails a greater ceding of national sovereignty, whether it doesn't. But I would observe that in the wake of these recent crises, it will be important for the European Union to find a sustainable place for the nation state in the future of the European project. And this is an age-old debate inside Europe about the balance between supranationalism and the nation state. But I think, again, particularly in the East and South, because that's where the main geopolitical pressures are hitting the most exposed countries, you see members of the EU that are moving back towards an emphasis on national accountability that has certainly deep legitimacy. It's rooted in history and culture and things that people care a lot about. Like any other process, it has, like any other political urge, it can be dangerous if it goes too far. But I think right now it's a correction or a reaction to many decades of assuming that the nation state was irrelevant and that it would continue ceding sovereignty.
Before we turn, you said South and East, before we turn to the East, we're not going to cover the South in this, it's just too much territory there. Let me ask you about Germany, particularly US-German relations, which seem to have soured particularly between Merkel and Trump. Of course, some would see it maybe as an intra-German dispute. But in terms of so many questions, trade, climate change, refugees, energy, there seems to be a downturn. And Germany still is the economic powerhouse of Europe. It is still the core, if you like, of the European Union, which I don't think fulfills all its responsibilities, particularly in the security arena. But nevertheless, how would you characterize German-US relations under Trump?
Well, I think the relationship on a day-to-day basis is very constructive. U.S. and German diplomats work very well together on an array of topics on a daily, weekly basis that don't attract the limelight. I think where you see some turbulence is in some of the areas that I mentioned earlier, where the United States looks at Europe in the context of an international map that is producing significant geopolitical challengers in the form of Russia and China, and correctly sees the need to be able to have some sort of some sort of global burden sharing arrangement with Europe. And in Germany's case, the economic and political weight of Germany is such that if Germany takes action on virtually any problem, it's going to have a disproportionate impact. And conversely, if it does not take action, if it doesn't live up to its responsibilities, then you see other countries having to step in and take up the slack. In many of the sharpest areas of disagreement with Germany today, the frustration, I think, of the United States and the frustration of many countries in Europe has been that a country, Germany, which rightly prides itself on its commitment to multilateralism, in many of the major areas of dispute with the United States is actually not taking the multilateral position. So Germany made a multilateral commitment at Wales alongside all of the other NATO member states to hit the 2% benchmark in its spending on defense, and now refuses to do so. On Nord Stream 2, this is a long-standing U.S. concern. I don't know of...
This is the pipeline, Russian pipeline into the Baltic.
That will deeply erode the security of fellow EU and NATO member states. Germany is taking a position that, other than maybe Austria, I don't know many countries in Europe today who are openly supportive of Nord Stream. I think the vast majority of EU member states are either openly against it or privately against it. So I think in those two areas alone, you see a Germany that is grappling with the question of how it will accept a greater responsibility for European security. That's playing out in German politics, and I think German political leaders will have to find ways of explaining to their public the need to accept a greater burden for European collective security, and that will require creativity and leadership. But we have to remember Germany runs a very large surplus and has the capability, should it choose to do so, to dramatically transform European security for the better in a way that allows the United States to devote attention to other areas of the world. So we need Germany to do that. The key is to get the Germans to a place in our relationship where they're willing to do that in a way that strengthens NATO.
I'll come back to NATO in a second, but obviously what's happening in Germany, German-Russian relations, German-US relations, are very closely watched in Central Europe, Central Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland, Baltic states, states on the front line with Russia. US relations with these countries have actually, I would say, improved over under the Trump administration. How would you characterize it? Do you think they have improved, and what has caused that?
Well, I think the relationship between the United States and countries of the eastern flank right now is very good. Poland has a very close relationship with the United States that has grown stronger in the security field. The Baltic states have had a lot of U.S. engagement, and I think there's an understanding in Washington that there's a need for a strong deterrence presence in the northeastern flank. We'll see where the details come out on any enhanced U.S. presence. But I think that it has now set in the period since the Ukraine war, certainly in the United States and across most of Europe, that Russia is a determined revisionist player, and that we have to have a stronger bulwark of defenses in the East. And so I think a lot of the strength of the U.S. North Central European relationship right now is a byproduct of that increased U.S. investment. So the U.S. has led or participated in about 150 military exercises in Europe in the last 2 years. We've presided over, this administration has presided over a historic increase in defense spending in NATO, upwards of $100 billion. And I think the position that the United States has taken on Russia across the board with increasing sanctions, bringing costs to bear in the aftermath of the Skripal attack, et cetera, I think validates the...
That's the poisoning, attempted poisoning in London.
I think it shows that the U.S. is deeply committed to the security of that region.
Going back to NATO, the President initially came under criticism for prevaricating on the Article 5 mutual defense guarantees, which he subsequently reaffirmed, which I think is extremely important. You mentioned burden sharing. Could you explain to our viewers how important, not just the 2%, but the other benchmarks, the other percentages that's actually spent on military equipment rather than salaries or veterans' pay and so forth?
Well, it's incredibly important. You have a commitment that was made at the Wales NATO summit, not only to spending 2% of GDP on defense, but 20% of the defense budget on major equipment. And that's important because in many cases you see European militaries that are devoting a very large share of their budgets to things other than capabilities. And of course that's a challenge for any military. But I think what has changed is because the external security environment is becoming more complicated, there's a need to see European militaries that can actually take the field and if necessary, fight. And this is why at the most recent NATO summit, there was the emphasis on the increased capability to deploy the so-called 20-20-20 formula of being able to put a certain number of assets in the field or in the air or in the sea at a certain period of time in reaction to a crisis. This is part of the emphasis on evolved decision-making structures, command structures in NATO. And I think for all of the media focus on political turbulence in the NATO alliance, I think the real story of recent months has been the increased serviceability and relevance of NATO. There is certainly no longer a question, as there was perhaps prior to the Ukraine war, about what the role of NATO is and why it exists. I think it has a very clear purpose, and across the board we've seen a significant increase in the number of NATO member states who are committing 2% of their budget to defense and meeting the 20% goal as well.
I think the 2% has gone up to 7, if I remember, and a few others have pledged by a certain year to do so. I mean, again, that's extremely important. This burden sharing question, I remember since I came to Washington, has always been there, but Trump has actually pushed more on this, I think, than any other president in recent memory. What else needs to be done on the eastern flank, do you think, to strengthen NATO defenses, deterrence vis-a-vis Russia?
Well, I think the most important thing is to move away from the concept that we had in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, that the so-called new member states of NATO are second-class citizens in the alliance, and that there should be a self-imposed Western restriction on the placement of military assets on new member state soil. I think we've now seen through Russian behavior in Crimea and Ukraine and Syria enough to justify a more sober-minded Western approach that, for example, I think the alliance has to reach a point where we are more comfortable with a permanent deployment of infrastructure and real estate. I think beyond that, and I think a consensus is gradually forming in that area, but beyond that, I think we have to bring U.S. and allied presence east of Germany in line with the thinking of the National Defense Strategy, which correctly identifies the need to move away from the old 1990s model of surge capacity moving up to forward hubs. And it recognizes the looming problem of anti-access area denial capabilities in northeastern Europe, but also in East Asia, and essentially says, look, we could face security environments in Asia or Europe in which the ability of the United States to surge assets towards conflict zones would be very limited because of the increased capability of our rivals. And as such, it follows from that we have to retool our thinking about forward presence. We have to have allied militaries who are tailored in their positioning alongside U.S. forward deployed assets to have survivability in the event of a crisis, so that we're putting the burden of escalation back where it should belong, which is on the shoulders of an aggressor, rather than allowing the Russians or the Chinese in the event of a crisis to place the burden of escalation both politically and militarily with the West.
Right, and we at CEPA actually do a lot of work on this, trying to enhance NATO mobility, NATO coherence, NATO cohesion. Let me ask you about cohesion. As Assistant Secretary, you dealt with most of the European governments. Would you say there's divergent views on what Russian policy is and how to respond? I mean, certainly if you go to the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, they have a very specific position. You have to be tough with Russia. If you go to Spain, Portugal, Italy, it's a little bit different. Could you sort of explain that?
Well, the first thing I would say that is encouraging is I think you see a lot more consensus than you saw a few years ago, certainly prior to the Ukraine war. I mean, we went through this long period in Western politics where there was this idea, even in Washington, that Russia as an actor had neither the capability nor the desire to militarily reshape its environment. I think we've gotten beyond that. I saw that, for example, in the transatlantic response to the Skripal attack, which was the largest Western expulsion of Russian spies and diplomats since at any point since the height of the Cold War. At the same time, below the surface, I think there are deep differences inside NATO about the question of Russia and its behavior militarily, economically, commercially, that is explained largely along the lines of national interests. So the further east you go and north you go, as a general rule, you find EU and NATO member states who have a sharper threat perception vis-a-vis Russia. The further west you go, by and large, and the further south and west you go, the greater insularity you have of member states. And frankly, the more there's a focus on threats from the south. And in that sense, I think Europe continues to be an uneven risk pool, both the EU and NATO, where the risk is concentrated primarily at the frontier, and the art of political statesmanship is convincing those who are not closest to the source of the crisis to support a common response.
with a couple of exceptions, I would say. They're Bulgaria, Hungary, Slovakia, who very much dependent on Russian gas and don't want to rock the boat. And I think actually been probably blackmailed or threatened by Russia that gas will be, energy supply will be cut if they take too strong a position vis-a-vis Russia.
I think that's right. And I think that too is partly explained by geography, that when you go north of the Carpathians, so into Poland and the Baltic states, you have countries that historically, because of their geographic indefensibility on the North Central European plain, tend to gravitate towards a stronger defense posture against Russia. Whereas if you go south of the Carpathians, you have countries that historically have not been as exposed to direct Russian invasion. Now, there are other forms of Russian pressure, and I think in the southeast you particularly see the use of corruption and networks of corruption to undermine Western institutions and suborn political process and even by politicians. But because the threat of invasion historically to those countries has been blunted somewhat by the fact of these mountain chains, I think you see historically you see a different strategic culture in those countries. And in the case of Romania, because you have a country that is partly beyond the Carpathians and is more exposed to the historic Russian push southwards through the Black Sea, I think you see a little bit of an exception there.
Let me ask you about also financial sanctions, which the EU recently prolonged for another 6 months, which I think is, again, goes with what you're saying about greater consensus and interpretations of Russian behavior. In Washington, regardless of what one thinks of President Trump's view of Putin, Washington's been also very tough on sanctions, imposed uniformly, I would say, with consensus, almost unanimity, I would say, in Congress, and obviously support from the National Security Team. Can you first of all explain why sanctions are important, and secondly, what more can be done to push back on Russian misbehavior?
Well, I think sanctions have two basic functions in international politics. The first is to punish, and the second is to deter. And in the case of Russia, the United States has applied sanctions, and our allies have applied sanctions for both purposes in the recent past. I think the most recent rounds of sanctions have to be viewed in the context of the overarching strategy vis-a-vis Russia, which is to raise the costs of aggression to a point that Vladimir Putin decides it's not in Russia's interest to pursue that path. And in that sense, I think sanctions only make sense in the context of a diplomatic and military strategy that is also supporting that larger goal. So, for example, sanctions that are implying costs on the political leadership around Putin and those sectors of the Russian economy that support national security functions or cyber functions and armaments has to go hand in hand with a strengthening of the U.S. defense posture that is recapitalizing our nuclear arsenal and ending sequestration, and a diplomatic posture that is applying sanctions where they are needed, but holding out the possibility, hard as it is to imagine, but nevertheless holding out the possibility of cooperation where there are shared interests. I think what doesn't work is the formula of attempting something like we did under the reset, where we had an effort at diplomatic détente or engagement at a moment when the U.S. was stripping back its military capabilities, was not modernizing its nuclear arsenal. And the reason that this is all important, that it go hand in hand and be complementary, these different aspects of strategy, is if the goal is cost imposition, I think you have to have a situation vis-a-vis Russia like we had in the late phase of the Cold War, where you are ultimately, the West through its own strength is forcing Russia to make hard choices about where it puts scarce military resources. And what we've had for the last several years, I think Putin has been able to pursue a much more adventurous and aggressive foreign policy than the nominal resources of the Russian state would suggest. And he's been able to do so while modernizing the Russian defense forces more or less across the board and gaining some significant edges in nuclear capabilities, for example. So I think that our job has to be to apply a degree of pressure across the board that the Russians wake up and decide that the path that they're on is not one that is good for their country economically or will achieve the desired results strategically.
Right. But sanctions have also been applied not even so much for military, of course, for the military attack on Ukraine and annexation of territory, but also for the, let's say, hidden attack, the disinformational cyber media networks. You know, these attacks on Western democracies that we've seen vis-a-vis the American elections, vis-a-vis various elections in Europe. So sanctions have also been imposed on that. Have we been successful in pushing back Russian interference in our democratic process?
Well, I think we've laid down a clear marker. And the midterm elections last year, I think you saw a very vocal public stance on the part of the U.S. government and interagency, all-of-government approach to ensuring the security of our elections. I think it will be a continuing task for U.S. Policymakers now and in the future to be crystal clear in our messaging to the Kremlin that there will be consequences, foreign policy consequences, economic consequences, etc., when we see indications of Russian interference. And I think that's something that we will continue to get better at, but is absolutely essential to sending the signal that, a public signal that's so important to deterrence. But I also think the Russians have zeroed in on a real blind spot for the West, not just for the United States, but for Western countries, that we rightly take pride in our democratic institutions. But internally, the polarization of Western politics is an opportunity-rich environment for Russian subversion. And so the Russians simply walk into a polarized Western political environment in the United States or in various Western European countries or in Albania, and they see an array of competing voices and simply put money and resources behind both extremes. And so in the U.S. context, I think what's incredibly important is to not politicize, to not wrap around our own partisan politics the nature of this threat. That, as I have said once before, Putin is not a student of the U.S. Constitution or of Jefferson or Adams, but he is a student of Haushofer and of geopolitics, and he sees an opportunity to distract and divide an opponent internally, and our job is to make it harder for him to do that.
Let's turn now to the Balkans, where you did spend a lot of time, and as you discovered, there's never a dull moment. There's always something going on. First question I'm always asked when there's a new president, and I keep being asked this vis-a-vis the Trump administration, has there been any notable change in policy, approach, objectives by this administration as compared to others?
Well, I think the goal remains the same, and that is to see the Balkans as a vulnerable frontier, and to bring Western, meaning U.S. and European diplomatic pressure and engagement to bear to close off that gap and strengthen the political and economic integration of the Balkan Peninsula towards Europe. That's palpably in the American interest for a variety of reasons, within European interest. I think where you have seen evolutions are in both in U.S. and in European approaches to some of the more salient crises in the Balkans, is a willingness to be more creative with the tactics for how we reach durable local conclusions. And so I would start with Greece, now North Macedonia impasse, so the name dispute, which was intractable for very many years. You see attack in U.S. and EU diplomatic posture
of job now, unfortunately.
Indeed. Essentially, the approach became creating space for local leaders to find local solutions to local problems. That didn't mean giving blank checks, but it did mean creating sufficient space for these leaders to figure out what they can sell to themselves and sell to their publics, and then at key junctures bringing in either quiet or conspicuous, as needed, Western support for that solution, but saying from the outset these are solutions that only the players on the ground can reach between themselves, and positioning the West to reinforce the movement in the right direction. I think the overall approach has been to see the Balkan Peninsula as being at a tipping point where it's possible within a few years to imagine the Balkans as being in a significantly better or worse position. It's very hard to imagine continuation of the status quo. And so I think the overall approach has been to start at the thin end of the wedge with the most achievable of the three problem sets, being Greece, North Macedonia, and then transfer the momentum from progress on Greece, Macedonia into Serbia, Kosovo.
Yep.
Try to pick up some momentum in the Pristina dialogue, and then get back to the point of where we were many years ago, where Bosnia was the, I won't say the sole problem, but let's say the most salient and significant problem in the Balkans. So I think that's been the overall approach. I also think that the U.S. has done a good job in the recent past of coordinating with the European Union. There are many areas where we don't agree with the European Union. This is one of the areas where we do, and where I would argue U.S. there is an unheralded degree of compatibility and coordination between the U.S. and EU. And on Serbia, Kosovo, I think above all, the U.S. approach has been to recognize that this is an EU-led process, and to try to do a little bit on the ground in Serbia, Kosovo, that, like what we did with Greece and Macedonia, which is to create space for the leaders in these two countries to find local solutions to local problems, with the recognition that those are the only solutions that are going to be durable. And so I think the U.S. has put weight behind the EU's approach of mutual consent and tried to create space, partly in the recognition, as I said, that the status quo is unsustainable. And I think that's the bigger point to absorb about the Balkans across the board, is that if we continue on the path of the last several years, sort of long periods of Western lassitude or neglect punctuated by little bursts of energy, I think what has changed is that we're no longer in a permissive strategic environment, that the Russians and Chinese have upped the game in the Balkans. And we have to be willing to invest diplomatic energy, but also be more creative to find solutions to these problems, or expect to see them morph in directions that would be very bad for European security.
I want to turn to the Kosovo-Serbia relationship in a moment, but I think you haven't given yourself enough credit. When you were Assistant Secretary, a number of successes in the Balkans, settling the Montenegro-Kosovo border demarcation, bringing Montenegro into NATO, which I think was an incredibly important step. As you mentioned, settling the Macedonia-Greek name dispute, which nobody for 20 years imagined that it could happen, and soon bringing Macedonia into NATO. I think the US should highlight these questions much more. These what were once considered problems that could not be solved have been resolved. By the way, when is ratification, Senate ratification, do you expect for North Macedonia?
I'm not sure when that's going to occur, but I think the political tea leaves are very positive, both in the United States and Europe, when it comes to North Macedonia with NATO.
Right.
EU is a little bit different picture, but
right. Yeah, sorry. Well, two questions. I mean, Bosnia, let's leave aside for the moment, because that's a subject of an entire show, I would say. But Kosovo-Serbia dispute, the Pristina-Belgrade dialogue, which has now been there for, what, 5 or 6 years, intermittently. At the moment, there's not a lot being said. Coming at it from outside, the process was already underway. How did you view the process? Has all the easiest, let's say, problems already been resolved, the low-hanging fruit? Is it now a question of dealing with the most core question, which is mutual recognition?
I think that, I mean, from a U.S. perspective, when you look at Serbia-Kosovo, you see certainly a lot of the low-hanging fruits have been consumed. But I think you see the potential for this conflict to either move towards a deeply frozen conflict that could flare back up, even in a military way, or to move towards a faster signposting towards the EU. And what we've tried to do in U.S. diplomacy is, as I said a moment ago, create space and local incentives, but also a lot of quiet engagement with both parties to move this along in a way that supports it is an EU-led process. I think in this dynamic, as in so many other equations where you have a virtually intractable dispute between two parties in international affairs, and in Kosovo's case, I would say that's a decision that only Kosovo's people and leaders can make. But I think we've now reached the nub of the issue with Serbia and Kosovo, where the time has come to move both of these states towards a Western future.
Right.
How they go about doing so is ultimately up to these two leaders and their publics. I think it's very important not to give blank checks, and I think both U.S. and EU diplomacy has done a good job of quietly telegraphing that this is not a matter of choosing a specific equation or formula, but it's also, so I think we can't have blank checks, but we also can't have closed ears. And somewhere in the space between those two extremes is where Western diplomacy needs to be. So from a Kosovo and Serb perspective, the key is to see that the West is certainly not interested in going down the path of boundaries that are drawn along ethnic lines, because I think it is a correct, it's a correct concern that this could become a template for others in the region. So it would have to be a sui generis set of circumstances, but to also signal very clearly that as difficult as it is for Vučić and Thaci to outline a common way forward, the last thing that needs to be put in their way is a series of Western roadblocks where we say what we will not agree to. So I think that's broadly where we're at now. I think it's the right way forward. I'm no longer in a policy-making position, so I leave it to the people who are in now to navigate the tactics. But I think we know what the old approach produces, and it's incumbent on us to create the space for a resolution, again recognizing that the strategic environment is shifting, the Chinese presence is growing, I think the Russian capacity for mischief making is growing, and it does create greater urgency to move this process forward.
So to be clear, in terms of the US administration now, the territorial option, in other words, border changes, population exchanges, are not off the table, but it's really up to the two parties involved in the dialogue to come to some agreement.
Yeah, I would put it this way. I would say if these two independent countries, under an EU-led process, are able to, and it remains to be seen whether they can, but if they are able to come up with a solution on the ground that works for the two of them under the EU banner of mutual consent, why would the United States stand in the way of that process?
So the EU would need to support this process, is what you're saying?
Well, the EU is driving the process now.
But the Germans in particular are very much opposed to any kind of territorial exchange. They've basically said it is not on the table.
Well, Germany is not the EU. The EU-led Pristina dialogue, the EU has the driver's seat. It requires support from key actors both in Europe and certainly the United States. I believe that the intra-European debates on Kosovo, Serbia are well known, but I have seen a shift in the German public stance even in the course of the last year, the last several months. I think everyone understands the sensitivity of the issue, and everyone has a desire to not create the wrong kind of precedent. But I think there is a growing consensus even among EU member states that we have to have a different approach than that we've tried for the last several years, which only ends in stalemate.
Let me ask another question. You mentioned giving them space to negotiate, in other words, Thaci and Vučić. I do remember during the Dayton process when Milošević, Tudjman and Izetbegović were brought together at Dayton, they weren't given a lot of space. They were basically placed at Dayton at the Air Force base there and said, well, you come to a solution, or basically you can't go home. You know, we need to finish this war and come to some sort of peace.
Yeah, I'm not sure how viable a comparison that is. I mean, I understand the point that you're driving at, and I will say there are moments in Balkan diplomacy on Serbia, Kosovo, where we will need to apply a certain kind of pressure. Right. But I think the analogy doesn't work in that you had in Dayton an ongoing war. You did not have a long simmering sort of frozen conflict that had fallen into stalemate that you needed to break out of. So I don't disagree with you that at key moments there will be a need for a certain kind of pressure. I think we have brought pressure to bear at certain points, even in the last few months, quietly. But I think your tactics diplomatically, whether you're giving space or you're applying pressure, have to be sized according to the circumstances of where the parties are in the negotiations. And at various points in the last several months, last couple of years, I think Vučić and Thaci have narrowed the gap between themselves. I think it is, I said this a moment ago, but I think it's important to recognize that this is an EU-led process, and properly so. That doesn't mean that the United States absents itself from the equation, but this is in Europe's backyard. And we have a long-standing emphasis in U.S. diplomacy on Serbia and Kosovo in recognizing that this is an EU-led process. And I think the European High Rep and Commission have done a good job of putting this on a track towards a narrowing of differences. And then the job for the U.S., I think, is to bring our considerable influence and diplomatic resources and strength to bear at key moments in that process, applying different kinds of tactics as needed, depending on where the two parties are in the talks.
Well, clearly Thaci believes, I think Vučić up to a point as well, that it needs to be a strong American role. Thaci, in fact, recently stated that without America, nothing will ultimately be resolved. And I think Vučić understands, I mean, the first thing they look at is what is Washington's policy. Let me ask you another question here. Should Russia be involved?
Well, I think, coming back to the first thing that you've said, I think from a U.S. perspective, looking at the Balkans, it is true that the U.S. needs to be, and I would argue currently is, a strong voice in the negotiations and in the talks. I think the balance that has to be struck is a very important one, but between two extremes, one being the Bosnia-Dayton model, which you've mentioned, which implies a degree of not only U.S. involvement, but wrapping the results in an American flag, which, as you know very well in the Balkans, has to be approached gingerly. And then the opposite extreme of what we saw with Greece, Macedonia, where the U.S. took an approach that was softly. And I think if we hadn't given Greece and Macedonia space at a key moment, and then backed it up with Western engagement and action, I don't know that we would be where we are.
But then made sure it was implemented.
I think, I think the art form from a strategic statecraft perspective comes down to timing. And when do you engage at a sufficient level that you're bringing pressure to bear and you're making the point that needs to move forward? But also, how do you avoid those moments where if you weigh in, all you're doing is providing ammunition to different groups on the ground who would argue that this is a solution that's being imposed from the outside. And in that tension or that balancing act, I think, is the art of diplomacy in the Balkans.
Yeah, I suppose it's easier to do that during a war footing where you know, you impose a peace, basically. It's difficult to impose a solution during a time of peace. I don't know, that's how I would more or less put it. But in terms of precedent, I mean, this is one of the worries vis-a-vis Kosovo. Of course, Kosovo and Serbia, if they come to a mutual agreement, there is no other case that I know in the Balkans of two countries exchanging territory. But I think it's more the potential partition of a country that could be used as a precedent for other pan-Serbs or pan-Albanianists in the region.
Well, I'm not going to speculate on where Serbia and Kosovo are in the talks now. Again, I think the guiding principle has to be to recognize that this is a local problem, and that only local solutions will be durable. I don't know ultimately what the two leaders are going to come up with. I think giving them space at this point in time is the right approach, which is to say, I don't think you can come in and say, here's a set of things that we will not listen to, because I think that's a recipe for simply shutting down the talks. But I think you approach in a very sober-minded way what the parties do come up with. And this has been the EU position now and the US position now for some time. If you revert to the old formula of stating up front a set of preconditions or things that you won't listen to, I'm not sure at this phase of the game how much space there is for a meaningful dialogue. Again, I think what we all know we have to avoid are outcomes that show lines on a map that are drawn on an ethnic basis, which the Balkan Peninsula, I think the stability of the Balkan Peninsula depends upon the demonstrated viability of multi-ethnic states. But I think to put the horse in front of the cart, we need to see what these two leaders believe they can sell to one another and to their publics. There are different formulas they could discuss, whatever they come up with. I think the key is for the United States to not position itself to be exercising a veto of an EU-led process with two independent countries that are talking about how they find a common way forward.
Do we need a special envoy, as some have suggested?
Look, I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not in the mix right now. I will say that my successor, in my private opinion, from an outside perspective, I think he's doing a magnificent job, has a lot of experience in the Balkans.
Yeah.
We have a great team of people at State Department who, with deep expertise on the Balkans, who work on this on a day in, day out.
Oh, he's been there for 30 odd years.
We have a very strong Deputy Assistant Secretary who's working on the matter. So I don't want to opine on, I think, you know, there are true professionals putting a lot more energy into these questions than is often known externally, for the very good reason that it often requires quiet diplomacy in the Balkans.
Right. Let me ask you about another country that we haven't really touched upon, Albania, which is now in the middle of a crisis just before the local elections. We don't know which way it's going to turn. We've had these sort of crises before, which often resolve in demonstrations. A new government comes in and the whole cycle begins again. Should we be paying more attention to Albania? Is this a danger in the region?
Well, I think Albania occupies very strategically important real estate, and has set, in the last few years, has set a largely positive example in certain areas of cleaning up its act on rule of law. Corruption remains continual entrenched problem in Albania. But I think the broader worry that I would have is both with regard to Albania and North Macedonia, is that I think the EU has a credibility problem. If it has signaled with the open door policy that countries which make certain strides will have a viable path to the European Union.
Right.
The decision that appears to have been made this month to defer the question of opening EU accession talks, particularly with regard to Albania, I don't perceive an intra-EU politics and debates over this as much resistance to North Macedonia as I do Albania. I think is a reflection of two big things. First, the state of the EU itself, that internally a lot of the larger Western European states are asking questions about the future of the EU, how much they want, their taxpayers want to continue to pay for transfer payments to the periphery and an extension of the EU. But I think it's also the facts on the ground are such that you have a degree of political chaos in Albania. The problem with organized crime and rule of law, I think, does reflect a legitimate concern on the part of the EU. And so I think the balancing act for the EU, I mean, look, you know, Russia exports its influence through gas. China has influence through money. For the United States, a lot of our influence is from security. The EU exports influence by exporting itself. And so I think for the EU to play a stabilizing role in the Balkans, at a minimum, it needs to be clear to Albania and North Macedonia that if you do the hard work of reform, the EU keeps its part of the bargain and opens the process for, and again, we're talking about what could be a very lengthy process of the accession process. But I think that's critical, again, going back to something we talked about a moment ago, the growing Chinese and Russian influence in the Balkans gives us a smaller margin of error. And we have to remember that for the Chinese, the Balkans, the Adriatic is sort of the terminus of the Silk Road project and Belt Road Initiative, and very critical entry point for markets and influence in Europe. That's why we see the Chinese spending so much on infrastructure development in the Balkans. For the Russians, I think the Balkans are a key area for cementing spheres of influence in Europe and keeping pressure on the EU from the outside. And I'd go further and say, from a Russian perspective, a turbulent Western Balkans further isolates as a kind of outcropping Romania, Bulgaria, and prevents the geopolitical consolidation of that region around the Black Sea. I think from a U.S. strategic perspective, it's important to keep in mind that the Balkans are about more than just the Balkans, that they're about the stability of Europe. I would argue that the ability to, for example, have Greece be able to turn more of its strategic attention to the Eastern Mediterranean, which is a very important goal going into the next couple of decades, will only be achievable if we have a fairly high degree of stability in the Balkan Peninsula. So I think we're at a moment where we have to see the West, and that means both the U.S. and EU, point the way forward to deeper involvement in Western institutions for both Albania and North Macedonia.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Very last question, Wes, because I notice we're almost out of time. Should we be doing more to push back and neutralizing Russian penetration of the Balkans? Should there be a more, let's say, forthright, coherent policy in the media, energy, corruption, political influence, cultural influences, and so on that Russia is exerting in the region?
Well, I think we put a lot of effort into that now, and there has been an uptick in U.S. and European attention to the Balkans in the last few years as we have seen Russian malign influence grow and Chinese infrastructure. I think it's going to be an ongoing strategic competition. Mm-hmm. I think the tools that we need to bring to bear span the realms of public diplomacy and cultural influence, energy security, mm-hmm. And institutional enlargement. But I think it will be important to note that in a context of strategic competition, where the countries on the ground have options and where there are other players bringing a lot of resources and money to bear for negative purposes from a Western perspective, I think it's important to, from a public diplomacy standpoint, mm-hmm. Recognize that these countries do have very rich ethnic and historic traditions, to try to prevent Russia in particular from using the Orthodox Church mm-hmm. as a battering ram of influence. And I think that that's one of the areas, together with commercial diplomacy, where the U.S. has been slowly stepping up our game.
On that note, Wes, thank you very much. Very much enjoyed it. Let me know when you're next in the region, particularly if you're coming to Pristina. And best of luck in a sort of post-government world.
Thank you, Janusz. Thank you for your
Thanks
time.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues at RTK and here at VOA. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. And see you all very soon. Mira Pavshim.